You already are infinite void. You just don't realize it yet.
Ooh.
The difference between what you actually are as an entity versus your own story of your identity, your story about reality, your story about other people's realities, the symbols in which you use to engage with the world. By really removing and distancing yourself from all of that and letting it just all meld into each other, you're left with a singular type of awareness purely from the place of your own existence as opposed to your identity and even the contents of your consciousness. With that really infinite, judgment-free point of view, you can then move through life and experience that state of like beauty that we were talking about before.
Yeah. Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. One of the things that I really want to make sure does not get lost in the sauce of concepts, in the intellectual ingredients that make up this recipe, that is this media vessel, is the importance of direct experience. You know, going beyond the ideas that we're throwing around and actually diving into them through direct experience whenever you feel called to, because there are types of wisdom that you only gain by doing. It's that non-propositional kind of knowing that we were talking about a couple of weeks back with Professor John Vervaeke. This isn't a kind of knowing that you arrive at through a logical string of propositions. This is knowledge you learn through being it, through doing it. You know, think of something like gaining a skill, riding a bike. Stop reading about the pony and ride the pony. Really meant ride the pony? You could have went back with the cooking analogy and you went with ride the pony. And the same is absolutely true when it comes to our own psyche. Because if you're not diving in to the majesty and weirdness that is your own consciousness, you're not only missing out on some valuable experiences, you're really ignoring the wisdom of the world's mystical traditions. And that, in part, is why I admire my friend Cory Allen. By the way, if you don't know, Cory is an author, podcaster, longtime meditator and consciousness explorer. He's a really unique example of how you can truly alter your own mind and your own life through exactly the kind of knowledge I was talking about above. He's got a lovely podcast, as I mentioned. He's written 2 fabulous books. He's got a fantastic meditation course, which goes from 0 to pretty damn deep, pretty damn psychedelic even. As longer-term listeners will know, there's so much more I could say about Cory, but I will leave links to all of the above and more in the description if you want to explore that meditation course or just go deeper on Cory's content in general. Same for Third Eye Drops. All the links you will need are in the description. But first, my friends, do please help us out by tickling the algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. I know you hear this all the time from YouTube creators, but it truly, really is important for the growth of this media vessel. We've got dozens of episodes in our audio-only podcast catalog, not only with Cory, but hundreds of other brilliant beings, over 300 of them, but you can only hear those on podcast platforms. So Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to pods, do subscribe. And if you want to initiate yourself deeper into the Third Eye Drops community, join in on a patron-only Discord book club, Zoom hangs, get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. Join us over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. It is also the best, most direct way to support these mind melds. I do hope to riff with you there. But speaking of riffing, let's initiate this mind meld with my wonder brother, Cory Allen. A lot of people who watch on YouTube don't understand the depth. They don't understand how tangled up our little roots are together in this whole podcast game. So it must be noted, Cory and I have been doing this together for close to a decade now, which really hurts my brain. But yeah, there's a long leash, but in some way we are psychically conjoined podcast siblings.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I love you, buddy. Welcome.
Love you too, man.
We're back again.
We were just talking about how things in the past that were like these events where people were massively present. You know, like you're at a concert, you're at a comedy show, you're wherever you're spending time with your friends. The level of direct absorption in those experiences is something that's like archaeological at this point. Like you almost cannot have experiences like that anymore. And what that does to a person's mind is, I don't know, it's almost hard to say what it does do to a person's mind because we're so caught up in it ourselves. You know, like it's I guess I haven't directly thought about that aspect uh of the psychology involved and constantly being connected to this like cybernetic digital realm. But dude, it is so profound. I think that the change, the gradual change in consciousness and connection with what you're doing has been huge. Like to a point where if you're somehow able to look at it all like an object, it would be like completely desecrated. It'd be completely blown apart.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that before in terms of, just that I've meditated for a while, and if one of the byproducts of that is having a sense of self-observation, right? So, like, I'm sure I've said it before, as like I'm kind of like the Jane Goodall of my own consciousness. Like, I just
Yeah.
follow my own mind around. I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. Look how it's feeling about this. Look what's happening here. Look how it's experiencing this. And I've kind of always been like that to a degree. So if I think back and sort of look at like how was I experiencing consciousness and reality as like a teenager? How was I experiencing consciousness in my 20s, like whenever the iPhone came out in 2007? How did that change until now, you know? And if I think back to what my self camera was recording, I would note that like I mean, especially pre-internet, but certainly pre-smartphone, like life was as if you were stuck in a movie. You were like
Yeah.
lost in this first person game of this film. And the benefit of that was that you could go very deep into the story. You could go deep forever. Like you can just
Mhm.
go into your own world, and there's not like distractions, not things taking you in different directions per se. Like you would have to kind of excavate and discover things to create these interesting diversions, but they were all generally based on actual novelty because there wasn't things being kind of shoved in your face. So like if you were, in the pre-smartphone era, like if you had someone that gave you a new CD or something,
Yeah.
you would be like, "Oh, let me check this out," and you'd listen to it, and it would like blow your mind. It would send you
Right.
down this portal. So that experience of reality was this long, like I said, kind of filmic sort of movie thing. But now what you have with like technology is now you're being pulled out of that story like 1,000 times a day. And like that doesn't necessarily mean that it's any better or worse. It's just very different. So now you can get into this, I suppose you can get into the same type of like deep experience, but it just takes a lot more discipline and effort to insulate yourself and kind of inoculate yourself from these things in life that will pull you out of your own awareness.
Yeah.
And then but it's interesting because then there's always a resistance to it, so that becomes a part of what you're experiencing too. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's kind of an interesting thing. Is like it's almost like we're fish and we're being like we're
Yeah.
being caught like a million times a day, you
Mhm,
know?
mhm, mhm. Yeah, there that thing that you pointed to just very quickly in the beginning, that ability to watch your own consciousness, like, philosophers or I guess neuroscientists would call this like meta consciousness, like the ability to reflect on your own mind and watch your own mind. And that in and of itself, or maybe you'd call it like a witness mind from a more, you know, meditation or Eastern informed way of viewing that phenomenon. But just adopting that sort of point of view, like even just doing it as a thought experiment right now for people who are watching or listening, rather than viewing your subjective experience from the first person or the third person, it makes a really interesting difference because now you're sort of you yourself, your mind, your body, all these things, they become sort of like an object that consciousness is watching rather than being you. And in some sense it's kind of semantical bullshit, but in another sense, it kind of changes the nature of your mind completely because you start to associate with some kind of deeper principle, but where you have to sort of confront this reality that we now live in with the technology, with the worldly distractions, with this competition for your attention. You have to admit that you're deeply divorced from that witness mind, or you're much more cut off from it than you could be. Because as much as you can say like, oh yeah, I know I'm this mind, I'm the mind behind all these activities, it's like, okay, but how much time are you really spending in that state in an unbroken, clean way where you're not being, pulled by potential dopamine excretions into this direction or that direction? Like, that's where it becomes not semantical and not just talk, but like a felt quality of life change, I think.
That's interesting that you point that out because I sort of see it differently. Like, I see it as in the witness mind, and you're observing just kind of the contents of consciousness and also your arising impulses and like your actions and so forth and your language and everything. I would notice just from my own experience, I would go, "Oh, look, I'm getting pulled into my phone right now." Like,
Yeah.
oh, so it's just more of this river of mental fragments and formations, which could be, "Oh, look, I'm walking through a beautiful forest and enjoying all of the, natural abundance," or it could be like, "Oh, look, I've been, playing chess on my phone for 2 hours now. Like that's interesting." So it's kind of the distraction is just more, and like those little moments are just more kind of pieces of the same thing to me. Like it wouldn't, for me anyway, it doesn't pull me out of that same meta point of view. I just notice it and it becomes a tool because then I can go like, oh, I feel the arising impulse to reach for my phone again. And
Hmm.
I just notice it before it even turns into action. So it's like there's the arising impulse. And then through that observation, you can then choose to move differently. Like, oh, well, I'll either not, like, why am I reaching for my phone? Do I need to do something? Am I just like doing it out of a habit? Like, should I not do it? Should I? And so it gives you this more, ultimately, what it gives you is more ownership and intentionality over what you're doing.
Yeah, no, but I totally take your point, but I also think you've earned that. Like most people haven't earned that, the ability to really be like, again, anybody can say like, "Oh yeah, I'm not being controlled by this thing. I'm aware that I'm doing it." You can have that sort of a mental check-in, but I don't think unless you've really earned it through really spending time in that mind state to understand what it is and to understand that it is somehow more basic and pure than the standard, to sort of code switch here into Jungian terms, the more persona based way of going through life where you literally get lost in the mask of the personality rather than understanding that that it is a mask. You think that it's you unless you've done something to understand that there's a deeper perspective behind that thing. And it gets so tricky because I think the other thing that ends up happening in this kind of a world that we live in is we become aware of a concept like this. And then we think because we're aware of the concept that we understand the phenomenological reality of being in it. And it's like, and that's something you and I deal with all the time because we're always like reading books, researching shit, talking to people on our podcast, and we come into contact with these ideas, but especially when you come into contact with like philosophy or contemplative stuff that's been around for thousands of years, the theory is actually way less important than trying to experience it yourself, like trying to get into those states yourself to be like, oh, this is what they're talking about when they say, like whatever one of these Pali or Sanskrit words or something. And I think that's one of the problems of today is like we're so used to everything being sort of transactional and ephemeral. Like even the experience of getting a CD, like you were talking about before, it was like an event. Like
Hmm.
you'd get a new album, it was like an event. And now you can just like wash through hundreds of songs on Spotify a week and never think about them again. And it's sort of like everything in life has become that way, where you can just experience it and then chuck it out. And there are some things that you can't chuck out, like that need to become foundational to how you self, to how you do life. And I think that's one of those things that's worth anchoring in, is that perspective that you're talking about, and that experience of witness mind or metacognition that you were talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And so you touched on a couple of really valuable things. Like one is that, I mean, essentially you summed up like modern culture in terms
Right.
of everyone you learn just like the Wikipedia first sentence of something, and then people feel like they have a sense of authority or like expertise. Like, oh yeah, sure, I know what that is. It's like, no, just because you know about it doesn't mean that you know what it really is, you know? And there's such a huge difference in those two things. Like it's hilarious to me, like whenever someone is like, I don't know, like I'll be talking to someone about meditation or something, and they'll start trying to tell me like with a lot of authority and assertiveness about X, Y, and Z. And then they'll be like, look, I've been meditating for like 6 months. I know like what's going on. It's like, all right,
Right.
enjoy, enjoy. Um, but the how much you allow yourself to marinate and really move into an idea. I mean, it takes patience and time to really let the information then melt in. Like you have an awareness about a topic, then it melts into kind of knowledge. So you're like, oh, I understand some of the gears and nuts and bolts of this thing. Then you have to live your life and apply that knowledge to your experience of reality. And whenever there's like a moment where that knowledge becomes really useful, then it turns into wisdom and known experience. That's just how it works, right? And like a good analogy for that is this person I know is this German artist who he was in living in Berlin prior to 1989 whenever the wall came down. And so it was very difficult for him to get music,
Mm.
and because they weren't exactly pumping, imports into into Berlin at the time. And so what would happen is they would have cassettes, him and his friends. And he said that basically you could either take like a 2-week vacation and get, the money for it, or you could keep working and get an extra 2 weeks of pay or however it worked. Point was is no, he's like you could take 2 weeks off and not get paid, or keep working
Hmm.
and get that extra 2 weeks. And he said that one cassette cost the same amount as 2 weeks pay.
Whoa.
And so they would not take him and his friends would not take vacations. They would take that money and go buy an extra cassette just so they could have more music. But then what they would do is they would take their little collection of cassettes, how many they had, and they created a tape trading circle. So it was like they would all make sure that they bought different ones, and they'd say, okay, like for this week,
Yeah.
everyone rotate your collection to the right, and you get a new cassette. And he said what it did, it was like the first time, in the 80s,
Yeah.
he heard something like, and imagine if you put yourself in the mind of a German person in the 80s and just kind of, especially behind a wall and what you were exposed to culturally. He said that he heard like a Prince cassette and he was like, what? This is like trash. Like, what even is this? But the fact that he only had that cassette, like that was the only new thing he had. He just listened to it over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, after several weeks, he was like, oh, wait a second, this is genius. This is
Yeah.
crazy. But it's because he had to really move into it and let go of his idea or his conditioned kind of reaction to it to experience it for what it was. It made the like the incredibleness of that art like arise and become apparent for him. But like our ideas and the way that we engage with knowledge and stuff like that is no different. It's like, so most of us don't have the discipline to really take something and go into that idea and sit with it and really understand it.
Yeah.
Rather we'd like just like to index a bunch of stuff so that we feel, if you like extrapolate, well, what is the point of just having this surface level kind of Wikipedia level knowledge of stuff, it's really a solution to a feeling that I think people have of like not having a level of confidence. It's like
Mm.
you want to feel prepared. You want to the more stuff you know about, then kind of the more comfortable you feel. It also reduces anxiety. It's like all these weird sort of really subconscious elements that happen. So anyway, point is that really spending the time to understand things is so valuable because it just turns that surface level knowledge into something that you couldn't have understood and you couldn't have experienced otherwise.
Yeah, man. Yeah, two things really stick out for me in that anecdote. One is that when things are scarce, they take on this sort of sacred quality, and that you just can't appreciate if you have ready access to it. And we live in a world where we just have ready access to so many things, and that by nature sort of degrades them into these things we can just throw out and just do away with. But the other thing that I think might be more interesting and lead to a deeper uh, sort of mind meld space is that this idea of how the mind changes when it steeps in something. Because even in the mundane example of that Prince cassette of not liking it, not understanding it, wanting to like reject it at first, you expose yourself over and over to it, and then you gain this familiarity, and it's sort of like you steep in that thing, and your mind sort of collects it. And I think that this is a nice metaphor because I think you can say that in a lot of ways, one of the best ways to think about the mind is in sort of a watery way. Like it is this amorphous thing that can completely change its qualities depending on like what receptacle you're putting it into or whatever it's interacting with. So that points to what we were saying earlier about how there's a huge difference between a momentary dip of a tea bag and letting it sit, right? And completely disperse into the space. And yes, everybody laugh at laugh at the tea bag. I want you to fully experience it. I want you to fully steep steep in that. Um, but that points out why it is so important to really get into these states and really allow the mind to get slow and watch itself and just stay there and just stay in that state and return to that state over and over and over again. And then that is when that state that we're talking about really just becomes the beginning. Like you see that there's almost this whole inversion that the mind is capable of, like where you really develop an eye into the inner world, and that in some strange way over a long period of time, and I'm not saying I'm there yet, but I believe this based on my experiences in various ways, and we can get into if you want, but um I think you can slowly come to the realization that the inner world is just as real as the outer world, and it's just as rich as the outer world. But our ability to view it is greatly compromised by the outer world because the outer world is so seductive, it's so bright, it's so, flashy that you can just kind of let that inner world become like a vestigial psychic limb. Like you never really go there, you never really even begin to experience again the water metaphor, like the depths of what's in that world. Um, and I'm tempted to ramble on more and more, but I won't because I'm sure you've got beautiful things bubbling up in your own mind water. I'll stop the mind water analogy now.
Yeah, I guess it's like sparkling water.
Mm,
Yeah,
give me
yeah. I
that
mean,
pamplemousse.
yeah. I'm more of a rambler man. Um, that's an Austin-based one. Highly
I like
recommend
that.
it.
I like Waterloo
Yeah,
as well. Waterloo's a big.
yeah. Well,
That's another Austin one. You guys are killing
indeed, it
sparkling
is.
water game.
Yeah. Also, I'll drop some OG Austin knowledge for people, given that I'm from Austin and there's a lot of new people here. Uh, if you want to really come off like an OG, the original name for Austin, the city, was actually Waterloo. That was
Oh,
what it was called first. That's why there's Waterloo Records, Waterloo Water that you
okay.
talked
I didn't
about,
know that.
Waterloo Bicycle. There used to be Waterloo Laundry back in the day. So a little bit of OG, give you some cred, if necessary. I can't imagine what situation we'd be in where that would be necessary, but there it is. Um, anyway, so you were talking about how the inner world is less tantalizing, it appears less
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
tantalizing than the outer world because the outer world is so distracting, and it's so rich in signal input, like our sense doorways are just getting tickled, you know, more and more as the days go on. And yeah, I think it's hard as far as like looking inward. I think it's hard for people to even disengage to take one step back from their
Yeah.
sensory input because it's crazy. It's like it's so rich and overwhelming that it's like your sensory input, everything coming in, your eyes, your ears, the feeling of your body, the smells, tastes. It's like you're like in a cyclone of data,
Yeah.
So how do you get out of a cyclone? And I think that that's why it's really hard. And why would you want to? You're like in this swirling Willy Wonka, like,
Yeah.
constantly
Theme park.
changing hallucinatory theme park. It's like Meow Wolf, that like art
Oh yeah, I
installation
love
place
Meow
you can
Wolf,
go
man.
to. It's like, well, that's just really what normal life is like if you just kind of like zoom out one click. This is Meow Wolf is cool because it just makes it a bit more apparent, or I suppose it form fits it to our preferences, which replicate or which give off signaling of the absurd, where it's like, so you don't have to see the absurd in the ordinary if you go in there because they make it apparent, but it's actually everything is like that all the time anyway.
Yeah.
But before we move deeper into this inner kind of world idea, I'm curious, like, what your take is on, so we kind of glossed over something where we're talking about like how it's really useful to go deep into a single idea because you can, obviously
Yeah.
get a lot more juice out of it. But I'm curious what you think about like how would someone discern in a world, where we live in now, where you're getting like
Yeah.
a bazillion ideas a day?
Yeah.
How do you discern which one is the one to spend time with? Because a lot of those ideas that you're getting hit with,
Yeah.
it's nonsense, it's useless, it's arbitrary, etc. So how do you kind of figure out like, oh, this is something really worth understanding?
Yeah, this is where I think about this a lot because this whole, quote unquote sense making thing has been a sort of movement, I guess, in the last 5 years. And I actually think what's funny is it sort of preceded the pandemic, but I think it's become more necessary in the wake of it because there's just so much more informational garbage to try to balance, and there's like this informational arbitrage or something where you almost have to, like, you get an idea from one area and you're like, is that a valuable idea over here or not, and I think that that's often a really instructive thing, and I'll explain that a little more, but it's a really, really long answer, I think, to answer responsibly, but to sort of put the responsibility off on someone else because they're gonna give a way better, way more multifaceted answer than I ever could. Go do something like watch the first episode of John Vervacky's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, because he essentially lays out the problems of modern life in terms of our, like, everything you're pointing to, like informational overload, gaps in understanding, not really knowing how the brain works, not really knowing enough philosophy in an even like ancient Greek way to develop a worldview that really comports with what it's like to be a human being that's searching for meaning and sense. So I think it's like a multidisciplinary thing that is like, an education problem that eventually culminates in, now that I have these bullet points, or at least understand these bullet points loosely, I'm equipped to think critically. I'm equipped to make informed philosophical choices for myself. Because you're right, like, in a world where people are equating, uh, you know, 4E cognitive science with Pleiadian channeled information. It's like those aren't the same. I'm sorry. Like, believe what you want. Good. Investigate what you want. I'm not going to tell you what to watch, what to read, what to believe, but you have to admit to yourself that not all information is equal. We don't live in a relativistic reality in the sense that, oh, it's all, just believe what you want, it's all kind of true. I don't believe that. I think there is actual truth, and I don't even just mean that on a material level. Like, I think there's capital T truth, um in a sort of like platonic universalist kind of way. But yeah, so long story short is I think you have to really, it starts with one thing that I'll try to boil it down to something here, and it's investigate from that sort of metacognitive view that we were talking about earlier. Investigate what your true motive is in taking up the information, because a lot of people don't really want direct, unfiltered truth. They want some kind of emotional security blanket. So some of these far-flung ideas that are wooey, that are new agey, whatever, they're going to provide you that. They're going to give you that emotional, spiritual security blanket. Like, oh, we're all part of the Galactic Federation and we're being taken care of. Like, that's there for you. But is your motivation really arriving at truth through accepting that, or is it serving you some kind of emotional security blanket? Because those are two very important distinctions to make. I'll leave that there. I'll leave that there.
All right, leave it. Well, this is one of the things I like about you is that I ask you how a person can tell what really is important to them. And you give me a 7-minute answer that involves plebeians, the Galactic Federation, platonic solids, or whatever you said earlier. Yeah, that's good stuff. So just thank you. I enjoy that. But no, I mean, I feel what you're saying for sure. It's like, um, my take on it is like tuning into, like, all the stuff you said is totally on point. I think, um, tuning into how you feel in terms of what arises whenever you engage with an idea. Like, and this is just of like in the question of what should I choose to look into more? What should I choose to kind of play around with idea wise? Like the ones that give you a visceral reaction, the ones that make your cell. This is like I've been trying to describe it, or I've been describing it recently as like where your cells feel like they start like spinning or something like that.
Mm.
All the cells in your body start spinning. It's like whenever we engage with certain ideas, we have these little reactions, but most of the time we're either too distracted or we just kind of blow them off. We don't really notice them, but paying more attention to how your body is responding to what you're observing and engaging with. And like, whenever you're reading about something and you kind of get perked up and you feel that sort of, I mean, I've boiled it down to like what makes you feel more alive. That's kind of a phrase I use often.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're reading something and you're like, ooh, that gives me a little bit of zest, a little bit of excitement. It's like, bam, there it is. Like, move into that, because that's where you found the wow. That's like where the wow is
Yeah. Yeah.
in your life, So, and then you might look into it and play with this idea and realize it's not for you, but just kind of paying attention to those little things that give you this kind of lift in your seat, I think is a good way to figure out. It's almost like subconscious divination. It's like, well, I think I know what I think I'm interested in, but let me see what's actually getting a response out of me. Like, what is my body responding to?
Right.
This can be a valuable tool
Totally.
to use.
For sure. Yeah, and also knowing that your body, I was going to say, can lie to you, but it's not that it's lying to you. It's that those feelings could be downstream of a kind of seductive lie still. Like, let's just use that same example. Like, people, you and I went to one of these events together a long time ago that is lives in infamy in both of our minds. It's like this super new age, like, I am an alien, not joking, not maybe, I am an
Hmm.
alien. I bet you when those people read that stuff, they get that feeling. you were talking about. They're like, whoa, this is it. This is the thing
Totally.
that I've been waiting for. And again, I'm not going to tell people maybe they're right. Maybe they're right. However, does the preponderance of evidence really point to that as more than a far flung possibility? I'm not saying aliens don't exist. I'm not saying this isn't real. I'm not saying that isn't real. But this like convenient narrative that's just for you and it just makes all the pieces fit perfectly. And then you can sort of just stick your fingers in your ears to all the things you don't like and go, no, 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 I'm an alien. Like, again, that's why I start with, is my motivation foundationally to understand something better? And if something does feel too like, this is something that I'm guilty of, because of course I have my biases and I don't want to live in a chaotic, senseless universe. So if I start being attracted to something, I have a series of check-ins basically that I do. And I guess I've developed this over a long period of time. It's like, who else thinks this way? Who's the smartest person who thinks this way? Let's see what they have to say. Who's someone who vehemently disagrees with this viewpoint? Let's see what they have to say. If you can come out of that kind of a even-handed exploration with that idea still intact, be like, you know what? There's something to this. Then it's like, then to me, it receives some level of blessing. I don't take it as an absolute truth, but then I can be like, yeah, there's something to this. There's a lineage of thought here. There are smart people today who still believe this. Um, I think those are all important things to do when you're weighing your information.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you're talking about the body lying to you in terms of it responding to things. I mean, think about attraction and like arousal.
Oh yeah,
I mean, that's A1, in that world. And if you follow that feeling forward, you will discover if it was a good or a bad idea, you know,
yeah,
or what the outcome would be. And I think that like, but that's what we have to go off of, right? And so I like the idea of like taking the information filter and applying it after the feeling of kind of spiritual arousal, as it were, because
hmm
it's good to, just because like whatever your galactic federation or whatever, like if that excites someone, they need to go into it not to become a member of the galactic federation, but to discover whether it's like what that story is going to do for them, right? So they go into it and it leads them down this long path of delusion, and they make a bunch of bad decisions, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then eventually, after going towards it for however long, they're then like disillusioned with it, and they're like, oh wait, this is a bunch of nonsense. Good. That was the scenic route they needed to
right.
take to understand this part about themselves, about the world, about what it means, about just kind of going into rando ideas like that full force. They might reflect and learn like, oh, I was actually I was lonely and I was seeking community. That's why I went into this idea, because there was other people around that believed it as well. Um, and so now I know the ideas and like those type of desires, that sometimes we move towards certain cultural things because of reasons that aren't so apparent, like deeper psychological reasons. So anyway, the point is like it's good to just go into those things, because you'll learn whatever it is that you need to learn a lot of times by doing so.
Yeah, man. Yeah, and this again is a perfect segue back into that mysterious inward word realm, because Cory and I are not here to rob your life of wonder. We're not here to tell you, this exists or that doesn't exist. But I will tell you that the good news is there's something stranger and way fucking more wonderful, I think, than that narrative. And it's literally something that is you on a deeper level than the way that we outwardly and popularly understand ourselves. And the portal to that wonder is absolutely your own mind and turning that lens around onto yourself. And it's not easy to see like the full splendor of that wonder. And even seeing the full splendor of that wonder, in my experience, it's not like it gives you an answer, but it does definitely show you're connected to levels of mystery that you, as a Cory, as a Michael, as a person listening, cannot fully comprehend and cannot fully contain within your ego. But still, you're able to get behind all of that and see into it. There's a Plotinus tract that's called On the Beautiful. And, it starts with him talking about, like, what is beauty? Why are things beautiful? But and it's a long it's fairly long. But the point that he eventually gets to is that the closest thing to absolute beauty that a person can witness is in their own psyche, is in their own soul. And you get to that beauty through the through what today we would call meditation, through today what we would call contemplation. And this is what's so crazy about everything we've talked about, is that he basically says the reason you don't see that beauty right away is because you're stained by the outside world. He uses the word stain. And like when the psyche is so stained by the outside world, it becomes blind to itself, and it becomes blind to its actual nature. Um, and he arrives at a lot of the same conclusions that Eastern mystics arrive at, in terms of, like, you will see that there's an innate oneness, there's an innate beauty, there's an innate, like, coherence to reality that you don't see in the outside world, and you can get there to the pinnacle of it from within. But he warns that you've got to undo this sort of staining and this obsession with the outside world, and think about how much harder that is for us to do now, man. Like, with what we're everything we've been talking about, with the distractions and the, like, technology and the like you said, the Willy Wonka like fractal cyclone of reality these days, is like, man, undoing that stain, finding a way to get out of the gravity well to even start that process of inner investigation is difficult. It's difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it all, in terms of the analogies that you were using there, I think that those are all good ones. I mean, essentially, what it sounds to me like what's being said there is that something that I think I've just experimentally or experientially discovered as true is that, like, if the world exists in your mind, then your mind is what the world will look like, right? The state
Mm.
of your mind is what the world will look like. And so by going inward and developing a relationship with your mind and your inner life, then what happens is that the world starts to look different because your perspective has changed. And I think to use some spot remover on the stain that has been created, you know, on you from the world, is basically speaking kind of metaphorically to, like, our subjective perception, like breaking out of the conditioned ideas and points of view that have been forced upon us by society, our families, et cetera, and kind of breaking free from that and seeing life more clearly for what it is, from a more objective and less presumptive and conditioned state of being. And to me, like, the more that you see reality with that level of clarity, the more naturally beautiful everything becomes. Because ultimately, even, like, tragedies in life, they're a part of the same aspect of beauty, like, from, I think, a more awakened point of view. And I mean
Yeah.
awakened by a sense of inner life. It's because things seem beautiful, not because they are. I mean, like, we should take a pause here. And while you're talking, I thought about this. Like, beauty, nothing is beautiful in reality. What's beautiful is things appear beautiful because our eyes have evolved and our minds have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to find things beautiful.
Mm.
Right? That's where beauty comes from. Like, green trees are beautiful because we evolved to see them as such, because on an evolutionary fitness level, green means water and water means life. And so we want our bodies want to move towards that because it will keep us surviving.
Yeah.
So, but then it's interesting is that somehow that turned into like 90-degree angles and like, smooth edges, and you get like a MacBook Pro and you're like, wow, this is beautiful. Some reason, this they've extracted all of the elements of what we find inherently beauty on an evolutionary level and created this object d'art thing that we're like, wow, look at this. But anyway, yeah, like, so things seem beautiful once you work on this relationship with your mind, because like the state of being, like just existing at all, is like just pure velvet. It's just like
Hmm.
it's just smooth and lush and soft and like incredible. And I think that that's where you can really get to, where like, well, yeah, of course life contains suffering and shitty things and tragedies and inconveniences, but that is all part of this whole thing, which is just being. And inherently being is like the most mind-blowingly beautiful
Yeah.
thing ever. But it just takes a perspective and a level of openness, and I think a disinvolvement with a preoccupation of your own egoic, preferences and desires, to be able to see that. And I think there's a sort of a architectural approach to this where, I've gone deep into both sides of that spectrum. I've gone really deep into this kind of, reductivist kind of materialistic point of view. And I've gone really deep into a like, I'm going to just sit by the river forever view. And to me, I feel like there's a good balance to be struck, where you always keep in mind the awe of everything and the beauty, but then kind of take all of that other structural stuff and be like, okay, let's apply this to the now so that we can move forward and like really take advantage of being by becoming more kind of industrious in our existence, while always keeping in mind the big picture. And I think that's a really, for me anyway, it's been a really wonderful way to proceed.
Yeah. Yeah, really well put, because it is a dance. Like that, you always do have to come back down to earth, and that's something that um it almost becomes harder to do the deeper you go into it, because there was a story I actually just heard about um one of it was either directly from, you know, some Buddhist scripture that's supposed to be directly attributed to the Buddha, or it's a story about the Buddha that was written after the fact. I think all the things the Buddha supposedly said weren't published or written till long after his death anyway, so who knows. But
That's
um
correct. It's all
yeah.
oral translation. So that's why if you read any commentaries on the Pali Canon or see translations, they all start with "Oh monks," XYZ,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
he's basically it's like the first podcast. He's like standing there and he's like, all right, everyone gather around. I have 10 listeners, 10 subscribers, and I'm gonna tell them my ideas. And so then it was just an oral tradition of all the Arahats carried his information, and then about 500 years after he died, they all decided, and I had read this somewhere, and so I don't know if it's how verified it is, but basically there was a lot of like roaming kind of wars and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So they thought, we better write this shit down just in case we all get wiped out. We don't want to lose the oral tradition. So that's what the
Yeah.
canon is.
Yeah, and it's important to note, because it's like at every turn, if there's possibility for power to meddle in the purity of the thing, it probably happened. So every time I read any of this stuff, it's like, yeah, maybe the older and closer to the source, the better. But the idea that we have some unpolluted, monolithic source of Buddhist knowledge seems like that doesn't exist. But
Yeah, and I do
um,
like the idea of just on a colloquial level, like if you look at him saying like "oh monks" and then like dropping some important piece of wisdom, essentially now that's like someone getting around their friends, like, hey, yo, everyone, listen to this shit. Check this out. Check
yeah,
this
yeah,
out.
yeah, yeah, like
Life is
the yeah,
suffering.
yeah, totally, yeah, right. Um, but anyway, there was some story, for whatever it's worth, about how as you attain these states of sort of meditative absorption, as they're often called, these jhanas, or the Sanskrit word is dhyana, you So just, I guess, to just give a real quick bullet point summary, it's generally accepted that there are these four jhanas, or four states of concentration, or meditative absorption that you can get into. And then there are also four what are called formless states that are more like ethereal or whatever. These states are sort of like signposts on your way to Buddhahood or enlightenment or whatever, supposedly. And there's descriptions of them, but the descriptions are very like problematic, and there's tons of disagreement on what they even mean. How hard are they to attain? Blah, blah, blah. But anyway, the story is that even if you've attained these states of concentration that show that you're on the right path, the second you go back into town, or you go back into everyday life, and you start hearing people throwing opinions around and having political conversations and blaming other people, he basically says like you're going to get sucked right back into it, and you're going to fall off the path. So he basically says, in this story at least, don't get pulled into it, don't go back. But none of us are going to do that. Like, we're all going to go back into the world, except for the 0.01% of people listening to this who are going to just suddenly go become a monk. But given the fact that we are going to all be what they would call lay people, we got to find a way to merge those two worlds. Um, and what's cool is, according to most of these texts, at least from my understanding, you can be a layperson and still attain these states. So they're not mutually exclusive, but then that leaves this, you know, emergent question of how do you merge those two things? Like, let's say you do start looking inward. Let's say you do start becoming absorbed in this, but then you're pulled right back into the like daily bullshit, and you're trying to square the circle of those two things. How have you done that over the years, and like how has your understanding of that changed over the
Yeah,
years?
it's interesting. You know, you mentioned being drawn back into it, and that's why like monastic living is a thing. I mean, you tagged it. You know, as far as like we're not going to go become monks. You know, stage one in a lot of cases of the pursuit towards being, you know, towards being a monk or Buddhahood is basically like separate yourself from society so that you're not distracted. That's why there's these monasteries. Then, of course, the Dharma is just circulating like COVID in 2020 back at these monasteries. This is a very strange analogy, but I stand by it. Um, yeah, so you know, first off, I like talking about the jhanas. They're very interesting, and I've experimented and played with them a lot over the years. And I will say that playing with them has, I would say, it's probably some of the most potent physical reactions I've had from meditation. Just in case anyone is not familiar, you know, I've meditated for 25 years and tried very much a spiritual eclecticist point of view of trying, you know, different bits and pieces from different schools and cobble them together and just basically like fucking with my brain as much as I can, just poking around and seeing what's inside there and what's in the inner life thing. And then, you know, for whatever reason, I have a real habit of trying to take it into the world to like kind of, because I feel like, you know, it maps onto what you were saying about like, sure, you can cultivate this sense of like equanimity within yourself, but then you go, it's the Ram Dass thing. It's like you
Yeah.
think you're enlightened, go spend a weekend with your family or whatever.
100%. Yeah.
Same
Great quote.
thing, you know, which I also appreciated that he said that he talked about living in Manhattan for a while and how he loved it because it was like being close to the fire because you're like always having to kind
Oh,
of
yeah.
deal with the noise and distraction and intensity and stuff. Anyway, so yeah, you know, and so out of all these experiences, playing with those things were really had an intense physical reaction and a very almost kind of like metaphysical reaction too. So just moving through them, a description of kind of passing, and I'll just create a one linear sort of, I call them moves. Like, I don't know if that's been used anywhere, but I look at like the processes that you can do in meditation are like chess moves.
Hmm.
So you're doing like, you want to have like move one, two, three, four, all have like a purpose. They're all speaking to each other, and they will end and like, I'm going to checkmate my ego, essentially.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
and so these moves you can do, like the first in the jhanas, are the most important thing is, of course, building up access concentration. So, like access concentration, for anyone that isn't familiar, which is probably everybody, is basically,
I do love this though. I'm glad we're going into this. Yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think there's so much like mystery around meditation that I think like breaking that in particular down is a useful one. So a lot of times when people meditate, they'll just sit down and close their eyes and kind of take calm breaths, which is great. It's beautiful. But if you want to really look inward and kind of spelunk into your own mind and being, what you need is a really strong ability to focus,
Yeah.
not with your eyes or your ears, but with your mind. That's like, there's a term called one pointed mind, which is speaking to just that. It's like, how long can you focus your attention on something with it without being broken? And you need to build that mental muscle, because then when you're in a deep meditative state and you're looking inward, you need to have the strength of focus to be able to, one, navigate just the wacky light show,
Yeah. Right.
psychological geyser that's happening inside of you at all times, but then also to be able to move and navigate through that area with intention, and to also the whole time remain in this metacognitive state where you're also observing what's happening in on an experiential level while you're doing it. I know it was way too complicated, and probably just like white noise, but here we are. So,
Well,
uh,
but that brings up a point that it highlights why it's hard to talk about this stuff if you're not doing
yeah,
it. Like if you're
yeah,
not going into the space and experiencing it and seeing, the variety of experiences, watching what your mind does, all of these things, you can't know. And even if you've been there yourself, it's still hearing someone else talk about it. It's not the same as experiencing it. And yeah, I don't want to cut you off, so continue.
yeah. No, you're totally right. I mean, like I was like a month ago or something, I was giving a talk, like a keynote to a bunch of executives, and one of them was like, "Why would you meditate? Like, what's the point of it?" And it was from a very earnest point. He was just like, I've
Yeah.
heard about this, but like, why do people do that? And I was like, to calm down and wake up. And then after I said that, I was like, oh, let me give you an actual answer, because that
Right,
just is
right.
like static. It doesn't mean anything. If you've meditated, you know what that means. But if you are outside of the experiential landscape, then you have no idea. Um, Anyway, so yeah, so access concentration is really valuable. So there's several ways to go about obtaining it, and what that is being able to. It's called access concentration because you want to be able to access this inner world through concentration, right? So I used to, like, way back in the day. This is like 20 years ago. I would like light a candle
Yeah.
and meditate and stare at the flame for, I don't know, half an hour or something like that. And what it's doing is it's training the brain to have one point of not only visual focus, but also mental focus. So, yes, you're using your eyes as a tool, but ultimately it's about your brain staying locked onto one thing. And if you look at one thing long enough, you will basically start hallucinating.
Yeah,
It's really
absolutely.
interesting.
Yep.
Um,
Even
and
the
so,
wall, like even anyone listening, if you don't believe me, stare at like get it close to the wall and stare at the wall, and the wall will start moving within like 5 minutes at tops. If you're
yeah,
not,
100%.
if you're intently staring, yeah, it's very strange. I get or evocative of a lot of things, but
Yeah.
yes.
Well, my take on that, after doing clocking in many, many hours of that during meditation, um, my take on it is, what's happening is that your perception is becoming like more subjectively malleable and less attached to the story of what your reality is supposed to look like.
Right.
So you're that's why it seems like you're hallucinating, because like if you're on a psychedelic, the all of the symbol systems which normally represent reality are loosened up a little bit. So you start seeing like you're looking at a Horsehead Nebula, and you're like, whoa, is that, Jabba the Hutt or whatever? And it's like, no, it's actually a star system, and it's because, so you see it, it looks that way because your symbol systems have become loosened. And so
Right.
in this thing of staring at something, your symbol systems again become loosened. And so you start to see like, wow, what am I looking at
100%.
here?
Yeah, yeah. Your idea of what stuff looks like starts to dissolve, and you start actually being in a more pure relationship with whatever it is. And whenever that pure relationship occurs, there's like malleability and movement. It's like
Yes.
I just shared that famous Alan Watts thing about living in a wiggly world yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
It's like everything's wiggly. Like a big part of our issue is that we want everything to be straight and perfect, but no, nature is
Yeah.
wiggly. You're wiggly.
Yeah. And that speaks, this is directly speaking, and it's no accident, to one of the points of the jhanas is there's a thing called signlessness,
Mm.
which is this very thing we're talking about. It's a deep, deep, an advanced meditative state where you are releasing the signs or the symbols of what you apply to all of your arising phenomenon. So, or phenomena. It is also a phenomenon, but the phenomena of your perception. And so you're experiencing, as you said, just pure reality, as close as one can get to it, as opposed to a symbol laden version of consciousness. So, right. So back to this access
Yeah, yeah,
concentration.
yeah.
Another way you can do it is, I used to do that, and this is also really interesting. It's kind of a little, it tickles my metaphysical muscle a little bit in my brain, because another thing I would do is I would stare at a doorknob, like, and I'd be in a room meditating, and I would just stare at a doorknob for like an hour, and that became really useful in terms of building up access concentration. And then later, I read in one of the whatever book it was, who knows, it was a long time ago, but one of the ways that, monks will build this access concentration is by this blue little symbol that they'll put
Yeah,
out
yeah.
there, kind of but it notes that it's the size of a doorknob. If I read it, I was like, that is so weird. Because there's been so many things, since we're in Wonder Dip territory, there's been so many things in my life that I have just experienced or be like, oh, that makes sense. Let me do that. And then later I'll read like, oh, they've been doing this for 1500
Right,
years.
right.
This is, it's very far out.
That is this what's called a casina meditation? Because there's this word I've seen. It's a like casina meditation, and I was like, "What the fuck is that?" And I started looking into it, and there are different kinds of casina meditation. So usually it is a disc of some kind, or
mm-hmm.
sometimes it's a disc. And I actually think there might be a fire one as well.
There's a
But
fire. Yeah,
it's supposed to help you get into these jhanic states. Like it's supposed to help you. But what's interesting is sometimes they're around different elements, and somehow doing different elemental based focus can somehow lend itself to these states, I guess.
sure. Yeah. I'm only aware of the fire one, the fire casino meditation. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
similar type of thing. Um, anyway, so once you do this, and I would say, another, like, a really awesome way to do it, that I would suggest, because you're kind of killing two birds with one stone, and meditation is all about killing, so it's really
Right.
useful. Um, is to, in your normal meditation where you are just, breathing, focusing on your breath, taking calm breaths, use your focus and point it as if you were pointing it at a candle or a doorknob or whatever. Point it at just your breath moving in and out. Point it at your chest rising and falling. And, I've mentioned this, I think, on your podcast before. If you need to get a little stabilization at first, you can think rising, falling, sitting as you're breathing in, breathing out, and then just existing. But you just focus on your breath arising and falling, and your chest rising and falling. And that's valuable because obviously you're going to keep your breath metered in that way, but also you're building access concentration because you've placed a point of focus on your breathing. And then this is where we can start to kind of take the training wheels off a little bit. And people that hear this will say it's easy for them to do. they'll think it's easy, but if they actually really try it and go deep into it, they'll see how difficult it just takes time to build up. It's a
Yeah.
skill. And that is, as you're focusing on your chest moving in and out, continue focusing on it and stop controlling your breath. So allow your breath to take over naturally, as if, like, if you're watching a movie or something, you're paying attention to the movie, but you're still breathing. It's happening automatically, right? Can you do that whilst watching your breath move in and out? And that's a real tricky one. And after time, you can do it, but it takes a lot of letting go, a lot with concentration. And that's why it's a good exercise, is because you're releasing the compulsive nature to interfere with what it is that you're perceiving while still remaining present with that phenomena.
Yeah, that actually makes sense because I think one of the things that it seems like basically every mystical contemplative tradition is unified on is that as you get into these like deeper states of concentration or deeper pure mind states, if you want to call it that, you sort of disassociate from the body. Like you sort of like, yeah, of course it's on autopilot, but you become less conscious of and concerned with the body. And you go, different traditions are going to call this different things. And I guess sidebar here, this is what's interesting is even though maybe all these different traditions may get to a different ontological root, like, famously Buddhists kind of think about the ultimate ground of reality as different as their Hindu forefathers did. And Platonists are going to be a little more probably closer to the side of Hindus. But what's interesting is they're all unified on that you must do this. Like you must investigate the psyche, or even from like a Jungian perspective, like you've got to get behind the ego, you've got to see the deeper layers of the psyche. They all uniformly agree on that you should do it. And what I think is interesting is concept isn't really your friend in these states. Like removing concepts seems to be more of your friend. Like
Mm-hmm.
getting it down to the purest point of um consciousness as possible seems to be the game. Like not reaching for any state, but trying to actually experience it. And again, like the mind doesn't like that, especially the modern mind. It wants to know, what is this? What name do I put on this? How do I do that? And it's weird because I guess in some sense we need words to guide us, like where we're going, what we're moving toward. But it's almost like the least amount is the best in this field. It seems like to me. Um,
Yeah, man. But it's like with anything. It's like, yeah, you need to know the concept so that you know the process and the foundation. And then you have to let go of it and get into the flow and just be the
yeah,
thing. It's like, like LeBron is not thinking like, okay, before I shoot this 3-pointer, I got to plant my feet. I got to bend my knees. I got to, jump in the rise. He's just like, he just does it. But he did that process mindfully a billion times whenever he was learning. It's
yeah.
same thing.
And that reminds me too, Plotinus. I don't think it's in that On the Beautiful thing, but it's somewhere in the Enneads. He actually says almost exactly what you just said there in terms of even in an everyday sense, when you're closer to the one than further away. And it's
Hmm.
essentially, he goes on to describe what today I would call a flow state. Is if your being is absorbed in doing something and you're acting in a unified, totally absorbed way, you're in a good state of mind. It feels good. It feels absorbing. It feels like you're not sitting there having discursive thoughts and questioning why you exist. It's like clear in those moments. It's the clearest. It couldn't be more clear why you exist. I exist to write. I exist to play basketball. I exist to podcast. And I can subjectively say that shit feels great. And when you
Hmm.
come out of those states, you feel charged up like, oh, where was I? I was just like being myself or something on some deep, very real, though unfortunately temporary way.
Hmm. Yeah, I do think it does fade into the rest of your life. So like there's like an afterglow where it comes with you, and the more that you practice those states, the more that the stronger that they sustain, I think, for
Hmm.
longer. Also, I want to say the Ennead sounds like something like you'd hear at an ear, nose, and throat doctor. It was like, my throat's a little
Yeah.
sore. He's like, well, your Enneads do have an infection, so we'll take care of that. Yeah, like, all right. So let's get back to the process here.
Yeah.
Um, so after you work on building this access concentration, basically, and like I'm not, we won't go through the whole thing, but basically, there are these kind of energetic like moves that you make. So the idea is that you want to start getting in this state of total calm with full awareness and concentration, and then you start going into kind of this state of awareness about all of the phenomenon moving into your sense doors. So, like I talked about earlier, you notice just as you're sitting there meditating, just notice like the smells, the what you're hearing, what you're feeling, etc. And then, of course, in Buddhism, the sixth sense is your thoughts. So, like you just think of your thoughts as another form of sense flowing through your body. It's all just going in the nervous system. And I've described like anyone that hears me say that thoughts are a form of sense, if they think that's weird, it's really like uh, we get mixed up because those senses that the information that we get from outside of our bodies, it's outside of our bodies, so it's very clear that it's just like sensory information, but our thoughts like come from within us, so we mistake it for who we are as opposed to
Right.
just more information flowing across the state of our consciousness. It's like if we bite and smell a fresh orange, we're not going to think like, oh, I'm an orange now, but if we think like I'm going to fail today, then we believe that is
Yeah.
true, even though it's just more data. So you start just observing and from a rather distant place the information flowing into your sense doors, and with your eyes closed and using this concentration, you're like, oh yeah, this is interesting, like I'm noticing like this smell like arising and passing through, I'm noticing this thought kind of passing through, I'm noticing this sound that I'm hearing. But it's not, it's wild when you start doing this because you realize like all of that information moving through is just kind of codified symbol systems, so like um I have described it where, like, to me, I could be meditating and I could have silence or like a lush ambient track that's designed for meditation, or the house next door is getting a new roof and there's 30 hammers going. Like, it's all just information, you know? It's how you relate to the symbols attached to the information that shapes your perspective, and then therefore your response or reaction, and then therefore your mind state. So as you are noticing all this stuff, you just start kind of notice the symbols and everything, right? And then you start backing out of the symbols, like we talked about earlier, the loosening of the symbol systems in which you place on your reality. You start letting those soften, like when you're staring at the wall for 5 minutes, or you're staring at the flame for a while and it starts getting weird. You start applying that same concentration to all the sense information, and you start stepping back away from your attachment to the symbols of all the information that's coming in through your sense doors. And once you do that, it becomes kind of funny. I mean, to me, it's very humorous because you're like, huh, like I'm hearing wind, I'm smelling incense or whatever, but it's just like wiggly, squiggly, like
Yeah.
it's not actually those things, right? It's like
Yeah.
I'm
Right. Right. Right.
experiencing a representation of those things. How interesting. And then you notice as you apply that to your thoughts, you're like, oh yeah, like this thought is not a fact. It's not some sense of truth that has nothing to do with me. It's just this strange, like, string of coded symbols moving across the stage of
So
my
true.
awareness, So
Yeah.
Go ahead. You feel like you're going to
I
say
was just
something?
gonna say I can't help but think of the Don Hoffman dashboard analogy, because in those moments it really does feel like that. It really does feel like I'm experiencing a certain signature of the like template of what it is to be have like a human body. And then you
Yeah.
start to realize like that you're saying that these are just like not the true nature of reality at all. Like these are like inputs.
Hmm.
And it's so funny, man, because Don will say like, "Oh yeah, I meditate." But one thing he said to me that I was like, "Hold on, bro. You don't just meditate. You're like, as far as lay people go, a very advanced contemplative." He just casually was like, 3 or 4 hours a day. I always meditate. I'm like, 3 or 4 hours a day? Like, that's a lot. Like that's not like trivial. That's huge. And he said he's done it for, I don't, a long time. So, clearly he's always quick to say that he is a scientist and that everything he's doing has to be backed by rigor and math and whatever. But it's no wonder. It's no wonder his mind is going in the directions it's going, I would say.
Totally. Yeah. He's like, I've just been eating sunlight for 27 years.
Right.
Um, yeah, for sure. For sure. So yeah, moving on a little bit. You then the next move in this is to, and I actually made a course, an online course about how to do this because whenever it's such a fascinating process. I just wanted to put it out there really for myself because I thought it would be something really fun to make, and that the people who happen to engage with it and approach it all seriously could have some really fun experiences. It's called Coming Home, if anyone is interested in that.
Yeah. We'll definitely
But
link that.
so then, after you're in this state of observing your sense information from a bit of a distance, the next move is to then get into a state of non-perception, right? So easier said than done, right? But how I would approach that is as you're noticing all of the sense information flying by, you then abstract it even further and further and further, right? So if you were hearing my voice right now, instead of hearing kind of the language and the words and all that stuff that's going through, you just continue to dial out of your attachment to like the symbols enough to where it sounds just like what it really is. Like what my voice actually is doing is it's just going like
Yeah.
that's really what my voice is, right? But because of the shapes that I'm talking in and the symbols that we have applied to those sound shapes, we're all deriving, even myself, ultimately a different form of meaning that's coming out of the words of what I'm saying. So if you then zoom out of all of your senses in that way, you can get into you can essentially let go of your attachment to those symbol systems, and then in your meditation you uh, go into this, like I said, this state of non-perception, which is just completely releasing the engagement with any of that information coming through. So you're like, it's there and it's all passing through, but it's completely like abstract. So you're essentially just engaging with this point of awareness in your own mind, and all the stuff flowing through or by is completely devoid of meaning or purpose. It's just more like air that's breathing in and out of your body, right? So once you get into the state of non-perception, then um, you would uh, start doing some work, right? So um, you want to start breathing in, right? And as you're breathing in from kind of ultimately, I'll just say your genital area, um, instead of trying to give you a fancy kind of way of like, well,
Chakra or whatever.
it's the floor, it's your pelvic floor. It's like, no, really, pretty much it's from your genitals, whichever ones you happen to have or don't have.
We should say too that there's this in the East. There's this tradition of that area, of the area like just below the navel, being this sort of like energy center. like the
Oh yeah.
Chinese call it like the Dantian or whatever. Um, and whether or not there's any ontological reality to that, that seems to be part of a lot of these traditions, is like breathing from that area,
Yeah, breathing from the
the
space
scrotum.
between. Yeah, well, yeah, breathe the space between your asshole and your genitals, and then you'll really be you'll be. That's the entryway for a lot of cosmic energy, according to many, many mystic traditions. So anyway, so as imagine you're breathing in from that area, and that the
I got to
energy.
make one joke. I'm sorry.
Please,
That's why
please
they call
do.
it the perennial wisdom, because
Yeah,
it's like
you might be onto something. Um, so imagine, and this is kind of interesting, right? So the same energy or like feeling of pleasure or arousal or force that comes from your genitals, right? Identify that feeling, like in as you're breathing in, imagine that feeling awakening and arising and flowing up through your body, right? So you're breathing in, drawing in more and more and more of that energy. It's coming up and you feel it actually like filling your entire body, until this is where it gets really interesting, is, or can get interesting, is that as you're filling yourself with this energy, continuing to breathe in from that place and feeling like the vibration, there's this method for like 10xing the held energy in your body. And so as you continue to build up and you can actually feel this, like, whoa, I'm feeling kind of like a almost like a teapot about to explode or something,
Mhm.
then the move is to picture like a drop of water dropping inside of your body in the middle of all the energy, and then the ripples from that drop moving out, like cause that energy inside of you to ripple upon itself and like explode,
Wow.
right? So it's, yeah, so it's almost like an echo chamber that gets super reverberant and loud, but it's just like one drop moving outwards, and then it moves back inwards on itself and just creates this huge resonance, right? So
Does
go
this
ahead.
meditation have a name, or do you know like where this one specifically comes from, or is this something that you've cobbled?
This is a Cory Cobble. Yeah.
Nice, nice.
um
It's interesting though, because as you know, I do something pretty similar to this idea, and I don't know if I've said what it's. I kind of don't want to say what it's called, just because it also comes from like a whole lineage, and I'm not trying to like co-sign a whole series of things, but it's just a practice that I've found to be, it's my favorite daily practice that I've developed, and it's fairly similar to what Corey is describing, with like maybe some more esoteric trappings, but it's the same idea. And it's interesting because I think that it's potent for some kind of real reason. Like this idea of actually either generating or downloading some kind of energy and then reverberating that through your being and outward. It's a it's a practice I recommend for sure.
yeah, it's fun to play with regardless of what the outcome is.
Well, and this is something I've been harping on a lot lately, and I think we've been talking around it a lot this conversation, but I just want to say it again, is like I always imagine more skeptical people listening than probably are listening, but there's a point where you have to turn your frontal lobe off and your discerning mind off, and just do the experience and have the experience and see what it's like. Because I promise you, it will yield good feelings. Like the way
Oh
that you
yeah,
come out of these, specifically these kinds of meditations, is like I am just so grateful and so just calm after these meditations, that it's like, yeah, I love it.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm, one of the more skeptical people that you'll meet, but all this stuff, that's why I like to call it experimenting and playing
Yeah,
around, because it's like we'll get into the laboratory, play around and see how it feels, see what works, see what the outcome is, take notes, and then try and develop it, you know?
yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Um, So, yeah, when you're in this state, this water dropping thing, you get this explosion of energy. Then, what will happen next, and this is going back to actually some written stuff about the jhanas, is that then the energy in the body is supposed to explode upward out the top of your head, right? So, it's like you've got that big buildup of energy, it explodes upward. And when that happens, you continue to breathe in the energy from this special place we described earlier, and it's arising through you, going upward and going out the top of your head. And you will then you're skewered by source energy essentially. And you keep breathing it in, making it stronger and stronger. And what happens in this state is that, like, you ultimately can continue to it takes some work, but you can keep charging it up more and more intensely. And what happens to most people is that your body will be like vibrating like really aggressively
Yeah.
because it's such an over. So if you think about, like, again, if you think about like an orgasm, you'll have like, a few seconds of where your body is vibrating, right? So this would basically be a similar type of energy that's non-sexual, that is causing your entire body, but you're just sustaining this, right? So your whole thing, you're just in that moment, um, which is really fascinating. And the more times that you practice that, the less vibration that you'll encounter. So the first time I did this, I was literally just like, and
Yeah, 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 yeah.
then after 3, 4, 5 times, then it becomes where you can really control it. So you're doing this and you're just sort of more like, you know, it's probably like an ice bath. The first time you hop in, you're like,
Right.
Jesus Christ.
Yep,
But
yep.
then time 10, you're like a Jedi.
And on
So
that
then,
note too,
mm,
even if you just do a breathing exercise like you would do, like the Tumo style or Wim Hof style, it's exciting the nervous system. So you do build up essentially like this energy just through the breath work. But if you're doing it as part of a meditation, I think you're adding some really interesting dimensions, because I could see some people being like, yeah, just do the breath, you don't need to do all this. Like, I disagree. I think there's a huge component to what you're talking about, like the visualization and intention of this idea
mhm.
of the energy and the water and everything.
Yes. So we're gonna get weirder now, right?
Let's go. Let's
so
go.
so as you have this like beam of source energy skewering you and you're vibrating all over the place, um, then what you want to do is start, like, imagine it all coming up and then going like directly into your heart, and then directly like into your mind, like into, kind of your third eye-ish area. So now you're feeding this energy into those places, and as it's moving out, it's magnifying, coming back in even stronger, and then feeding back into those places, right? And so then imagine that you are, after that, you'll imagine uh a lotus, right? I know this is getting weird. Imagine like a lotus floating on water, and now you're full of all this energy blasting through you. It's very intense, and as you go under, you start like visualizing yourself moving through this lotus and then actually going underwater. And as you go underwater, all of that energy, it all stops flowing through. Now you're underwater, and you're imagining and visualizing and feeling like all of these kind of lily pads on the surface of the water. And this lotus is still up there, but now you're completely calm. And the feeling of underwaterness, we all know that feeling, is this really slow, kind of beautiful void that's very natural. And then you're in this space where you feel this kind of cleansing, energetic, intense, pulled away from the delusion of symbols of your own consciousness. And then when you're in that state, you then really start like releasing yourself into this infinite nature of this void space that you're in. And ultimately, what you're doing is really releasing the boundaries of identity of self to move into the emptiness state of like connecting with all things, or we could call it oneness.
Yeah, so you're describing going into this void space, and this is something that I remember from reading about the various jhanas. Is like this might be one of the formless ones actually. Is that there
Hmm.
is this specific thing where you try to imagine infinite void, and that seems like what you're describing here. And I don't want to derail this if you have a whole process going, but I am curious. You know, maybe from like the vantage point of most people listening, like why would I want to be infinite void? Like I don't understand why I'd want to be infinite void. But that is an important thing, it seems.
Yeah, well, you already are infinite void. You just don't realize it yet.
Ooh.
That's the key. That's the
I
key.
like that. I like that.
And getting into infinite void is it's quite beautiful because what it does is it highlights this is all working towards what we're actually talking about at the beginning of I think of this podcast is that it is going through a process of making it super clear the difference between what you actually are as an
Mhm.
entity
Yeah.
versus your own story of your identity, your story about reality, your story about other people's realities, the symbols in which you use to engage with the world. And by really removing and distancing yourself from all of that and letting it just all meld into each other, you're left with a singular type of awareness purely from the place of your own existence as opposed to your identity and even the contents of your consciousness. And what this does is it highlights, and at the beginning I said how, everything you experience is in your mind. And so therefore, your mind is everything you experience. Then with that really, uh, kind of infinite and judgment free kind of point of view, you can then move through life and experience that state of like beauty that we were talking about before.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, all right, so we're underwater. We're in the void. We got the lily pads. We got the lotus. Then now we're getting into some Cory cobbling here. But then in this state, you'll feel like incredibly calm and peaceful and just like you're connected to all things. Then I would say imagine a single like candle flame like in your mind, right? And then take a breath in. And as you breathe out, imagine that candle flame is extinguished. And whenever you do that, it's the last attachment you have to your preconditioned sense of self.
Mm.
And then you just have this quiet, like what I would say is close to an enlightened state of awareness that most people will be able to arrive at.
Wow.
That blowing out the candle flame, there is a translation around nirvana that is literally called blowing out. It's to blow out. That's what it's
Mm.
talking about.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a big I think that's a big chasm for a lot of people is squaring this idea of emptiness and a void with enlightenment because it almost sounds like they're two juxtaposed terms like
Yeah.
enlightenment and void because I think most people think blackness, infinite, emptiness. And then people are like, wait, shouldn't enlightenment feel illuminating?
Yeah,
Like
that's why I gave
light?
the just a lot of times the lost in translation nature of this stuff is it weighs it down and confuses a lot of people. A lot of times if you just flip it inside out
Yeah.
semantically, then it'll make sense because it's a cultural issue, right? So like in Japan, they in ideogram language they have words and symbols that mean stuff that we don't have. This, you speak
Oh
Japanese.
yeah, of course.
They
Yeah.
don't mean the same thing. We don't have that here. It's like I actually spent a long time, I was like, why don't we have a word for existence without anything in it, right?
Right, right.
And they have that in Japan. I think it's mu, right?
Yeah, that
MU.
that word, yeah, that word is often, it's funny because that's one of those words where sometimes it's translated as infinite or void.
Yeah.
And then in that you see okay, I see how infinity is void in some
Yes.
strange way, even though we would think of them as inside out. And the other thing too worth saying is, at least this is my experience, and this is what I've gathered from other mystical traditions, reading them as well, is void is actually luminous. It's a luminous void, not like
Yeah.
a void of nothingness. It's like a void. It's a like, and again, we reach the snake eating its tail because it's the void of everything, not the void of nothing. And if you really focus in on that, you realize it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it was just pure everythingness or pure nothingness, it's all the same. Like
Yep.
the mind can't comprehend a difference there.
Yeah, that's why I like to use the word oneness to describe
Right.
emptiness, because that's what makes sense to Western people.
Man, I know there is no end to this, but I would assume, to wrap this up, I will point people toward your course for sure. But it may seem like we went from the bar from, like, everyday life and distractions to like the deepest possible
Yeah.
meditative states. If people are looking to just start somewhere today, like maybe we've got their wonder whiskers perked up enough, like, fuck, today's the day
Wonder
I'm gonna
whiskers.
actually, I'm gonna meditate. Like, what would you, and I think this is important too, because in a popular Western sense, we're given this like dry mindfulness, what Miles Neal would call McMindfulness sort of meditation, that's divorced from all of this deeper exploration to a point where you almost don't know that it is supposed to be going
Yeah.
towards something. So I'm glad we got into that. And another thing too is, I just wanted to mention this before, is when you mentioned thought is like a sense. I think one of the very first things in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is this idea of vritti in Sanskrit, and vritti means ripple. And
Hmm.
essentially, he says it's the mind's nature is to create ripples. Like, that's what the mind does, is it creates ripples, and those ripples are thought. And yoga is the, and I'm nutshelling here, I don't remember the exact quote. Yoga is the understanding of the working with and the cessation of vritti. So it's literally understanding that this is what the mind does. Here's all the things it will do. Here's how I work with it, and here's how I even work toward making it completely placid and existing in the oneness. And that, there's another word. It's like vritti. We don't have that, and it's so much more rich than just thought, or
Yeah.
something like that. Um, but anyway, if you want to leave anybody with a parting invitation to just start to do um, some kind of basic inner inquiry, what would you
Yeah, I mean,
prescribe?
the basics are also I wasn't I put out this course like, I don't know, a year or two ago. I haven't thought about it in a long time. I didn't come to try and sell it to people. But if you're interested in
I'm
that,
happy to do it.
yeah, if you're interested in the course, um I made it where it literally starts at like beginner level and then goes to where I was just describing. That's why I call it like, go from a beginner to a master. And I design it where it's progressive. And so like there's 12 pieces to it. So piece one is, an hour long, essentially, a bit of content that you're going to learn. It's the basic. The second thing is, now the basic won't take you as long because now you're familiar with it. So now that's 50% of it. And now, part two is now a new half is introduced. And then step three is like, now step one is you still start there again, but it's 30% of it, and so forth and so forth. So you basically progress. It's like weight training or something. You
Mm.
progressively grow, but you keep starting from the beginning and adding on a new piece to the end, until by the end you're, underwater with lotuses and you're blowing out the flame of your consciousness and whatever. Um, but yeah, I mean, I feel like I say this every time I come on the podcast, but like, doing anything and keeping it simple, contrary to what I was just describing, is really where it's at, because if we look at the main goal, we really want consistency. in
Yeah.
meditation. Most people will be doing and engaging with is like they want to shift their nervous system from sympathetic to parasympathetic. So they're not in a constant state of fight or flight. They want to be calm, self-aware, and able to speak and act intentionally in their life as opposed to being controlled by their reactions. And so consistency is huge. Every day, sit down, close your eyes, turn off all the sounds, and just take slow, calm breaths for 5 or 10 minutes. You'll experience your thoughts, you'll feel things, whatever, you'll get distracted. Just keep bringing your attention back to taking your breaths. And consistency is everything, because what we're doing is you're rewiring your nervous system. So do it every 5 times a week for 2 weeks, and just notice how a little spaciousness has faded in your life between your impulses, your thoughts, and your actions or your reactions. You do it another 2 weeks, you'll notice that's a little bit stronger. Another 2 weeks, and it'll keep progressing and getting
Hmm.
stronger and
Hmm.
stronger until that's generally where most people want to be. It's like, oh, I feel a little bit more calm, a little bit more self-aware, a little bit less anxious. Great. That's a good way to
Amen
do
to
it.
that, my friend. This has
Yeah.
been a great one. This is we were doing shorter ones for the longest time, and this felt super quick to me. Hopefully, it did to you
Nice.
too. But
Yeah.
loved it, man. Always love talking to you. Love you. Oh yeah, pro tip. I just have this right next to me because I do meditate in here sometimes. In the beginning, it's great to have an eye mask because
Mm.
it's just like you don't think about how much cognitive power there is in having eyes open and looking at stuff, but that is such a dense information portal, and when you completely remove it, I think in the beginning especially, it really helps you get into the like calm state much more quickly. um, and then
Oh,
eventually you
yeah.
get to that state where you're Cory and you're like, oh, they're doing construction 24 hours a day next door. I don't even care because I know how to access that mind state regardless. I'm not there, but
It's just texture, man. Remember, it's just everything. It's just all texture.
yeah,
Yeah.
amen to that.